All right, welcome. Hello, this is an interview today with Ward 1 candidate Elliott Payne and President of the Minneapolis City Council. Hello.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming in. I know you're busy. You had a council meeting today. Well, we were talking a little bit beforehand. You were elected in 2021. Maybe you could just fill in your background a little bit. I'm not sure if you're actually like a lifelong Minneapolis resident or you moved here from anywhere, but tell people a little bit about yourself.
Elliott Payne, he, him. I represent Ward 1 on City Council. I'm also the council president this term. And I actually moved here from Milwaukee in 2000 to go to the University of Minnesota for mechanical engineering. That's how I started my career. I worked in manufacturing. Found myself very unhappy in that career as the only black engineer in the factory and working with a bunch of baby boomers who I could never tell if I was getting treated with disrespect because I was the only engineer, because I was the only college grad, or because I was black, right?
And I want to make it clear, I'm not actually, despite what my children say, I'm not a baby boomer.
Right,
I'm Generation X, which we always get.
And I'm an elder millennial, so I'm as old as you can be to be a millennial, so I have some Gen X millennial crossover probably in some of my sentiments. But I went to grad school at Carlson School of Management for an MBA because I wanted to do that career shift. I worked in a lot of contexts around manufacturing, supply chain, distribution, operations, did a lot of enterprise resource planning, consulting that put me in a position to have much more of a software and technology background, pivoted into a career that was much more centered in technology and design. And that was actually how I made my way to the city of Minneapolis. I actually started on the innovation team as a human-centered design thinking expert on that team back in 2016. And I ran for office in 2021, obviously following the murder of George Floyd. And my team was actually actively working on a community-led approach to public safety that would, it initially started as a much more open-ended exploration where we narrowed in on prioritizing mental health calls at the time. The problem nature code, which is how a 911 call taker codes a call, EDP, an emotionally disturbed person. We were looking at that as a target for a potential new first response, and what grew out of that was the behavioral crisis response. I ran for office because we were midstream in the development of that program when George Floyd was murdered. All of our work stopped. A lot of that had to do with the lockdown because of COVID, and the city wasn't a particularly nimble institution when it came to going to remote work. Later in that summer, we were able to, really get our feet under ourselves, and we spent the better part of 2020 putting together the design of the program and the budget for the program, which passed at the end of 2020. And just as we were underway on saying, all right, we were successful in a very contentious budget year to get the resources necessary to build a mental health responder program, that was when we started to get a lot of pushback from the administration, and I would characterize it as sabotage. And I realized that as happy as I was working on a really high-performing team within the city, we could no longer perform given the political climate. There was a lot of layers to it. It's hard to say that it was the mayor that opposed it, but there were a lot of layers within the bureaucracy that did not want to see that program launch or be successful, because at the time we were on the cover of the New York Times for Defund the Police, and the work that my team was doing was getting coded that way. And so I saw that I needed to step into an elected role to make sure that that work was followed through on. And I'm really, really proud to say that our behavioral crisis response is available 24/7 in every corner of the city.
So it's one of your, I think, crowning achievements. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, and it's very personal to me. My brother is bipolar. I've had to call the police on my brother when he was having a manic episode. The police actually apprehended me because I fit the description. I mean, this is something that is near and dear to me, and it's life or death. And I'm really proud to say that in the city of Minneapolis, if you're having a mental health crisis, there is going to be a professional mental health responder without a gun who's going to be the first response.
And when it first started, I think it was in, well, maybe before we get into that, you're running for re-election. Any particular motivation or like open project that kind of is driving you to do it again?
Yeah, I mean, my entry point into this was the unfinished work of launching a mental health responder program. I still see that work as unfinished because, to me, this is a part of what it means to build a comprehensive public safety system. And part of a comprehensive public safety system is not just building new services like the BCR, it's also about reforming the police and implementing the state settlement agreement, as well as the provisions of the federal consent decree. Mm-hmm. The Trump administration withdrew the consent decree, but we as an institution, and this is one of those areas where we have pretty universal alignment around the city of Minneapolis, from the mayor to every single council member, that we want to implement the provisions outlined in the federal consent decree. The key there is that without a federal court holding our institution accountable, there is no roadmap on how to do that. And I want to continue building that roadmap and following through on what we need is a safety system that's accountable to the community.
So, looking at your website, it looked like there was 3 top priorities for your campaign. One, as you described it, is safety for everyone, I think, space for everyone, and climate action for everyone. Are those the top things there?
Yeah, and then I would say probably one that we need to add as something a little bit more urgent is responding to an authoritarian regime, which is how I would see the Trump administration.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm confusing it, but I think you had on your website a bit about like the city being one of the first layers of defense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about your first one there, the safety for everyone. You mentioned the behavioral crisis response that was in the neighborhood safety department. Mm-hmm. It's now in the fire department. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about why that change was needed.
Yeah, there's actually 2 real reasons for that. The primary reason is I see behavioral crisis response as a Tier 1 first responder program that should be on the same level as the police department or the fire department. When you call 911, you don't have the space to try to figure out what the right help is. You just need help. Mm-hmm. BCR is that help. And it's our job as a city to make sure that we're getting the right help, right? So whether that is a violent robbery that's unfolding, a house fire, a car accident, or a mental health crisis, the only thing you need to know as a resident is to call 911. Our call takers will take it from there and send the right help. So part of the move of BCR is recognizing that this is a first response in our public safety system. We have this really comprehensive Safe and Thriving Communities report, which I think is actually very helpful in establishing this framework of responsive, preventative, and restorative. So,
and for people who may not know, I've looked at that, but could you just? It's a very extensive report that was put out by, I'm not sure exactly who.
Dr. Oftelli, he's part of, I don't remember the organization within Harvard, but he's actually the independent monitor for Seattle's consent decree. That was some of his professional experience, and him and a number of researchers out of Harvard worked with the city of Minneapolis to develop a comprehensive public safety roadmap, I would say. It's a plan and a roadmap with 3 core pillars: preventative, responsive, and restorative actions. So how do we actually build up the infrastructure and capacity to have those 3 pillars as a foundation for a comprehensive public safety system?
And so what seems to happen is, like, when city council puts something forward, a lot of times it's backed up, or they'll refer to that report and say, we're trying to move this along.
Yeah, and
right?
the reason that is we need to be speaking all in the same language, and words have meaning. And one of the things that I've seen as a general theme in politics, not just unique to Minneapolis, is that people will use the same word with completely different meanings associated with it. And so a big level of work that we do on city council is core research, just so that we're all speaking in the same language with the shared understanding, and not just the shared understanding as policymakers, but as a community, because everything that we do on city council is only done through the power that is vested in us by the residents of Minneapolis. And so if we're not in alignment with the residents of Minneapolis, any action that we take is going to lose legitimacy. So part of us having that legitimacy is that core understanding that's why we've made such significant investments in our legislative department.
Okay, so kind of going back to the BCR, it's moved into the fire department because you basically kind of want to have it elevated to be seen as on par with these other emergency response. And I'm sure you know, it seems like statistically it's gotten a lot of phone calls, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, are these divided out by like which ones go to the police and which ones go to BCR?
Yes, yeah. Not only do we have that divided out, but the latest number I saw which is probably a month or two ago, BCR has responded to 35,000 calls since it launched in December of 2021. And one of the biggest, one of the things I'm proudest of is not just the total volume of calls, which every one of those calls represents the reduction of interaction with somebody in the police, which sometimes the police, they're carrying guns, right? And the tragedies happen when, you have to make split-second judgments. And if the gun is your tool, that split-second judgment has lethality associated with it. So every one of those calls is reducing the chance for lethality in our city. So that's one thing. But another thing is that we want to actually be really careful about the safety of our first responders, right? And a big component of how we design the program, actually one of the most critical steps of that program is the dispatch and making sure that we have the right training so that those call takers can triage the situation and understand, is there potential for violence in this interaction or not? And so about 10, 11, 13%, somewhere in that range of those calls, BCR has to call MPD for backup because they need to make sure that they're safe as well. So if they, based on their judgment on scene, that there might be violence, they will call MPD for backup. But one of my favorite statistics is that completely inverse to that, in similar kind of 10 to 13% of those calls, it's MPD is the first responder. They realize this is actually a mental health call, and they call BCR for backup so that they can move on to their next higher urgency call.
And I did see that the police chief, I believe his name is Tyner, right?
Fire Chief Tyner, yeah.
Is retiring after
Correct.
like 30 years. So is that going to change anything with the program, do you think, or?
Largely no, because the program is ultimately a contract with an outside organization, and part of moving the contract into the fire department, I shared the one reason we need to treat it as a tier 1 first responder program. Reason 2 is it didn't really fit in the model of neighborhood safety. A lot of the programs in neighborhood safety are in the preventative and restorative buckets of that comprehensive approach. They're not really equipped for managing responsive programs. At the end of the day, though, the work of managing BCR institutionally for us is the work of managing a contract that has terms to it and a set of protocols around invoicing and tracking time and all of those exercises. And so the fire department has a really robust set of infrastructure when it comes to administration, especially administration of contracts. NSD, Neighborhood Safety Department, is still in the early stages of establishing their infrastructure.
Yeah. So that's one thing. So Canopy has that contract, and I am curious, like, if this is going to be and I don't know how long that is for, 2 years or 3 years, I'm guessing at least. But is there any talk of like actually making it a department that would be part of the fire department, or just a city department as opposed to an outside vendor? Because it definitely seems like the city has a huge number, and even the neighborhood safety department, I think there's over 40 different contracts. So maybe you could just talk to that a little bit. Like, is there any plans to bring them in-house, and how do they decide when it should be outsourced, essentially?
Therein lies your question, why am I running for re-election?
Okay.
This is going to be a 10-year vision, right? And my 10-year vision for BCR is that these are city employees that have union jobs that are a core part of city services. The practical reality, though, is when we were running into the challenges of getting this launched because of pushback from the administration, I found myself needing to run for office to be able to be in a position to make sure that that program implementation was successful. Part of the reason me running for office is because I was a contractor on my team. The rest of my team, they actually sued the city on their way out for a toxic racist work culture. It was horrible to work for the city of Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd. And it was bubbling under the surface, these kind of toxic elements that have been pervasive within the city for years. After the murder of George Floyd, it was a completely insane, toxic,
And so
heartbreaking place to work.
Help me understand what that means, toxic. I mean, does that mean people not getting promoted, or does it mean like
That means
evil emails? I mean, what does it mean?
that means when you're a black employee in the city of Minneapolis trying to get data from a department so that you can make data-informed decisions and how you're doing program design, after a number of weeks of getting ignored by the person who holds that data, asking your white colleague to ask for the data so that you can get it.
That does not sound good.
It's very toxic.
And I hope, have things changed? I mean, is that improved since we've had some distance from that time?
Well, so every single person that I've described where that situation unfolded no longer works for the city other than me, right? So it's changed because none of those people are there, both perpetrator and victim of that type of interaction. But has the actual structural conditions of the way that the city is governed and managed changed? You could say under the new government structure, that's quite a dramatic change. Has that change led to culture change is a different question that is not answered yet.
Okay. All right. Is there any more you want to talk about, and just in terms of the, and I don't want to take you off of your top three items. I mean, just to maybe we finish out this, because I do want to come back to the structure, right? The strong mayor and council and all that, but that's a big topic. And I want to make sure you get your points in here. So what is the current status of the neighborhood safety department? You mentioned, and I mentioned, there's a lot of contracts. Do you feel like they've made some good changes there? Is that on the right path? Because there's been a lot of turmoil around.
It's on a better path than it was a year or two ago. We now have Amanda Harrington as the director of neighborhood safety. As you recall, the city was in a lawsuit with neighborhood safety, largely to do with the practices of contract management in that department. We have settled that lawsuit. Part of the settlement of that lawsuit was putting into place a series of financial controls and requirements for each one of those vendors. And we are, under a settlement agreement, working through a lot of those financial controls that did lead to things like family members getting contracts without oversight, partners of department leaders getting contracts without oversight. And one of the greatest frustrations that I have as a believer in a comprehensive approach to public safety is that when you have that type of mismanagement unfolding, it completely undermines the concept of community-led approaches to public safety. And so this is one of the reasons that in my role as audit committee chair, I've made significant investments into our city auditor. And in fact, I think one of the things we're going to talk about is, what are some of the big accomplishments that I'd want to highlight. I would say one of my biggest accomplishments is hiring a new city auditor that has an extremely professional approach to oversight, because I think that's what was sorely missing. And I think it's continued to be a major challenge within the city of Minneapolis, particularly in the administration, to have oversight over this, because a big frustration, particularly as not just a council member, but as the president of city council, is the discourse in this city about how the city is managed or run. And I will be the first to tell you, I think there's a lot of mismanagement and a lot of lack of controls within the city of Minneapolis. The problem is that that is largely under the authority of the mayor, under an executive mayor form of government. We do legislation and budgets. We have an oversight responsibility, but when we actually went to this new form of government structure, we spent the very first term of that, the 2-year term, solely focused on the organizational chart of the administration, with very little investment into the legislative department or the city auditor. This entire term, I've been trying to rectify that, and it's a fight that it shouldn't have to be if you believe in good governance.
So there was some call for moving that whole department under the county. Was that motivated by thinking that they would have better oversight, or?
I would correct. It wasn't moving the department to the county. It was moving the youth group violence intervention program to the county, which they have some of that programming already at the county. And actually, one of the big themes under the Fry administration is a lot of the staff that ran that programming in the city, when it was well functioning in the health department, left the city of Minneapolis to go work for the county.
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to, go off too much on take you from your stuff, but I think there is some good reasons why the moving even the whole entire department to the county could be made. And one, there was one vendor that was duplicate billing, I think both Hennepin County and the city, and it just seems like that's a real I don't know. It's kind of, the county does a lot of those kind of preventative programs, and so it seems like they could take it over. But that's maybe a topic for a different day. And then a couple of the other things that you talk about is the cultural districts, the safety ambassador program. Could you just maybe speak to that a little bit, like how it's different than neighborhood safety? And then I think you wanted to make the Community Commission on Police Oversight more effective. So maybe touch on those two things.
Yeah. So the Safety Ambassador Program in the cultural districts, we got one-time funding from the state, thanks to some of the leadership, in fact, of Senator Omar Fateh, to make investments in public safety. In the end of 2023, for the 2024 budget cycle, I made a big investment in a Safety Ambassador expansion program. So the Safety Ambassador program that people are most familiar with is run by the Downtown Improvement District. So these are the folks that are downtown in the high visibility outfits, helping people with directions, picking up trash, but also being the eyes and ears on the ground for any safety issues that might need to be escalated, right? So they're trained in de-escalation. They might be able to step in their own right, but they are not police officers.
And they're paid for through the Downtown Improvement District. Right?
That's right. So there is a service fee as part of the Downtown Improvement District that is based on the frontage, square feet or yardage for each of the buildings, and there's a few zones, so there's a higher fee and a lower fee depending on what zone you're in. But that's the sustainable funding source for the Downtown Safety Ambassador Program. And what's really critically important to the operational model of the Safety Ambassador Program is the fusion center at the first precinct. And so we actually just built a new first precinct. We have a very modernized and technologically advanced operations center in our first precinct. It's right across the street from the convention center now. Used to be in an old fire station downtown. And it's that really tight coordination with MPD that is the distinction between a safety ambassador program and something like the violence interrupters. Violence interrupters are based on an established research-based public health approach to violence prevention. And one of the really core features of that model is that you're a trusted messenger. And to be a trusted messenger, you can't be viewed as a collaborator with MPD, because you're trying to build a relationship with the people who have the risk of engaging in violence and diverting them away from those types of activities. You won't be successful in building the type of a relationship that's going to be predicated on trust if that person is worried that you're going to go and reveal your conversations to MPD. Mm-hmm. So the Neighborhood Safety Department is largely built up of programming that is centered on prevention. Within prevention, we have a number of different programs. We have the Safety Ambassador program that is in the Neighborhood Safety Department, but is a different model from the Violence Interruption program, which is based on the concept of a trusted messenger, which is different from the Group Violence Intervention, which is really about bringing somebody who we either have a high degree of confidence or at least a pretty strong suspicion is involved in violence, and basically calling them in and having law enforcement representatives, prosecutor, social services all in the same room and saying, hey, we know what you're doing. If you keep doing it, here goes the consequences, and that's when the prosecutor steps in. But if you work with us, we're going to get you connected with social services and get you on a different, healthier path.
And which part of I'm sorry, I got a little confused there. Which program does that? Is that the interrupter program?
So Group Violence Intervention has the call-in, that is the cross-disciplinary intervention with somebody who has a known history, but you may not exactly have a case against them. You might have enough knowledge to see that they've been involved in carjacking, but you may not have enough evidence to bring full charges. But it might just be a matter of time, right? So that's the conversation you're having with them. And there's a lot of collaboration between law enforcement, prosecutors, and social services. Group violence intervention, and this is why it's important that these are actually not city employees. Group violence intervention is about being a trusted messenger, building a relationship based on trust, and helping guide people towards better choices. Safety Ambassador is eyes and ears on the ground that is in tight collaboration with MPD. They're trained in de-escalation. They might be able to resolve a conflict on their own, but they are radioed in to Central Command to call in dispatch for backup when necessary.
And so there's been a couple of pilot programs, I think, along Franklin and maybe Eastlake. Mm-hmm. Those are the ambassadors.
Those are the pilot safety ambassadors that were funded with the one-time money that we received from the state of Minnesota, which you actually have a really big part in, to be honest, because if you recall, the mayor was trying to take that money and do a one-time police bonus, which we blocked because A, we had a vision for the safety ambassador program, and B, one-time bonuses for anybody who is actually knowledgeable about recruitment and retention, that's not a durable solution to the problems that we have in MPD. The problem that we had in MPD is reputation, and they had a historical underpaying because over many generations, actually, the union traded away money for management rights. So part of the new police contract that this council approved this term actually tried to rebalance that. So that's why you had these historically high pay raises, is because they were historically low relative to peer agencies. In exchange, we got more management rights back.
And there's a new contract coming up soon, right?
Yeah, under active negotiation.
Right now? Okay. Mm-hmm. And when do they vote on that? Because it seemed, didn't we go down to the wire on the last one? I feel like there was.
Well, the city has a long history of basically running out of time and having these contracts not get resolved before they end. And because they're first responders, their contracts don't expire. They just, instead of getting renewed with new terms, you just continue in status quo until you get to a new contract.
Well, so the police are obviously a hot topic in the city, and you know what? And we haven't gotten to the Community Commission on Police Oversight, but I'm curious where you stand on, like, do we hire more? Are we? You mentioned there's the state contract that's in place, but we're still going to try and do the federal. Where do you think we've got more work to do and where are we making some progress?
We need to start first with data. We did a 5-year comprehensive 911 call study to see what is the actual volume of calls that require police officers. And through over 20 million calls for service, they did a staffing analysis that found, depending on your staffing model, and by staffing model I mean how long a shift is, how many hours, is it a single patrol officer, a single car patrol, or a single officer patrol, or a 2-officer patrol, some of those types of factors. For the calls for service that absolutely statutorily require a police officer, we would actually be okay with a police force as low as 250 officers and up to 400 and some officers. That would just be the number of officers responding to 911 calls. Obviously, we have more tasks to do than respond to 911 calls. We need to do investigations. There's a lot of follow-up that needs to happen. But that data paints a much broader picture around what is possible. And one of the big challenges is that to get to those numbers, you also have to calculate in what calls could be handled by a different service. So we talked a lot about BCR and the number of calls that they can take on, but there are other calls that other types of first responders could take on as well. So we're actually in the middle of another pilot that my team actually worked on way back in 2019 that never came to the light of day until now, around having a civilian traffic crash investigation team. That's another pilot that we're looking at. So in that really comprehensive call volume analysis, if you take out the mental health calls, if you take out the non-injury car crashes, if you take out the nonviolent theft reporting, and then you only factor in the calls that really require a badge and a gun, you could have a police department as small as like 250 people. We don't have that option. We have a staffing minimum of 731, and we're hovering around 600 right now. And what's really important is sequencing. We can't optimize the size of that department without fully building out these other capabilities. And so that's another one of the reasons that I'm running for re-election, is that we need really long-term concerted effort on being able to build these new models out. Like I said, my team originally presented the idea of traffic control responding to non-injury car crashes in 2019. We're in 2025, right? We're at the end of 2025. So these programs take a long time to develop, let alone prove that they're effective.
So that was a lot. Let me just try and parse that out a little bit. So you want the data, and I think it sounds like part of that is to figure out, like, well, how many times do we really need to send the police out for like a traffic accident or something like that, and how many times do they need to go to like a behavioral crisis situation, and then the non-violent events, robberies, things like that. So it seems like you're narrowing down what the police would do to just handling like violent interactions. Is that where you're
what we're statutorily required by the state of Minnesota that has to have a licensed peace officer to respond to. So and we need to be intelligent about it, right? We shouldn't have it just to our statutory minimum. We should have it the right balance that's the most effective use of taxpayer dollars.
Well, I'm sure you are aware of this, but you're going to get some resistance if you try and actually reduce the number of police.
No one's talking about reducing the number of police. I'm talking about what the data says. And the data says that for the volume of 911 calls, the size of the police patrol force, so not talking about investigations or any other roles that a sworn officer does, the data is very clear that it was like 240 to 416, if I'm remembering off the top of my head. So we need to have an actually fact-based conversation about what public safety means in the city of Minneapolis. And I think that one of my biggest frustrations is, regardless of what the data says, we've increased the funding for the police department every year I've ever voted for a budget, but there are still propaganda films that are talking about how the police got defunded.
Right. And another category that I would say is maybe not in the data, and I don't know if there's really how you gauge this, but certainly a lot of people in the community feel like there's a deterrence effect to having the police out there. So even if they're not responding to a call,
Certainly.
I mean, I definitely hear like neighbors complain all the time, like we never see police in our neighborhood. And I'm sure, and there's other neighborhoods where they're probably there too much, right? So I don't know how that works into the data equation, but I feel like, people do like seeing.
And I think that's reflected in our property taxes. I think in 2021, when the question was on the ballot of, again, not defunding the police, not abolishing the police, the question on the ballot was, shall we create a Department of Public Safety, including police, and have it report to City Council? That was the question that was on the ballot. What lost a lot of attention was actually the strong mayor question that was also on the ballot. That actually happened to be a much more profound question on the ballot, because as we saw, despite ballot question 2 around creating a Department of Public Safety failing, the strong mayor decided to create it anyway, despite what the voters said.
You're talking about the community safety.
The Office of Community Safety
right.
is effectively the question that was on the ballot. Yeah. What's missing in my summary was the elimination of the staffing minimum, which I think is absolutely necessary, because what we are doing right now is we are artificially inflating the budget of the police department, meaning we are increasing your property taxes to pay for officers who are not going to be sworn in anytime this budget year. What we should be doing is budgeting based on the amount of overtime that we expect and the number of officers that we need based on the data.
Yeah, I don't quite understand. I mean, the overtime numbers, which are huge, and I mean, I assume that's partly because people want police officers. We don't have enough, so they're having to do overtime. And that if we were to hire more police officers, that overtime should go down in theory, right? Is that safe to say?
And it should go down once we've actually built out some of these other programs around not just BCR, but like I said, civilian traffic investigations. One of the big areas of investment that City Council has made is around civilian investigators, so that you don't have to have sworn officers pulled off the street and sitting at a desk doing desk research. Those civilian investigators work with sworn officers who have maybe more extensive investigation background, but they're able to do a lot of the legwork so that we can actually improve our case close rate. One of the things I hear the most when I'm out knocking doors and on the phones with constituents is, they call 911, and, I even get really good feedback for the response times for some of these calls, right? So I know the response time is a challenge with the staffing, but even when we have really good response time on a 911 call, the follow-up isn't there, because we have to prioritize good response times on 911, not on follow-up. So one of the things that I'm hoping to achieve, especially with our civilian investigators, is to be able to free up more time for those sworn officers to do that, improve those response times, while still getting closure for some of these cases that leave a lot of victims of crime just without justice.
So I want to ask about those civilian investigators. It was actually, I think, one of the things that motivated Miriam DeMello to run. Was, I'm going to mess up the details here, but some accident or something that had happened to her or a friend, and she felt like there was no follow-up, no investigation, and so that was motivational for her. What does that mean when you say civilian investigators? So, and then would they be part of the police department?
Yeah.
Or okay. So
the difference is a sworn officer who has a license from the post board, who had to go through the police academy and had to meet the academic requirements before going to police academy, which can take up to 2 years for somebody, if you wanted to be a police officer starting today. Now, you might have a college degree right now that might translate to...
I could go into ICE. It only takes me 6 weeks.
Well, then there's ICE, sure. And they have very high standards there, I've heard.
Sorry.
A civilian investigator, whereas a civilian investigator, for instance, my understanding is that we have an investigator that has a background in finance. They worked for a bank doing fraud investigations, so they have some really foundational understanding on how to do some of the core investigative work, although they don't have a license from the post board and they're not licensed to operate as a police officer. They can still do that work as a civilian, and that was in fact one of the big wins that we got in the police contract, and it was one of the things that got me to a yes on supporting the police contract was, there could be a union dispute of saying, hey, these people aren't our members and they're taking away roles from our members. So there could be some opposition from the Federation for those civilian investigators. One of the things that I did at the beginning of that negotiation is I drew some really bright lines, and I actually thought I was going to go into the police contract as a no vote, but as we started going through all the wins that we got in negotiation, I saw all of my bright lines that I had outlined checked off. I had to be a yes in that, and so that's really the core of what a civilian investigator does and what it means structurally for the police department. Is it means that we are freeing up sworn officers to do the work that only sworn officers can do.
Two things I want to say is, one, I really appreciate that you were flexible mentally about that you had things you wanted and you got them, and so you change your vote essentially. So I think that shows a certain open-mindedness based on facts, and I appreciate that.
I see a lot of ideological reactivity in our local political climate, right? Like there's a reflexive and reactive ideological standing up for police, and an ideological reflexive being against the police. And one of the biggest things I am trying to advocate for is an actual mature conversation grounded in data and facts on what keeps people safe. And sending a police officer to a garage break-in where your bike got stolen, that's not going to keep you safe. And in fact, what you're going to need is a report for your insurance company. We could have a civilian do that on your behalf, right? And in fact, we actually have been putting investments into our digital infrastructure so that it's more user-friendly for you to submit that report on your own. We're not where we need to be on the user experience, and I actually am a user experience designer professionally, and I will tell you, it's not good user experience on our city website to submit a police report, but that is why I'm running for re-election, because we need to make the types of investments that get us towards a public safety system that actually keeps people safe and provides justice for people when we fail.
I think what a lot of people would say in response to that is like, yeah, you don't need a sworn police officer to do the report, but we want to see them in our neighborhood to prevent those break-ins in the first place.
We want those break-ins to not happen in the first place. Right. And we need to actually be data-driven and based in fact on what's going to be effective in making sure that that doesn't happen. If it is data-driven and based in fact that having a police officer just parked on a corner is going to prevent break-ins on that corner, that would be a very interesting fact. And then we'd have to compare that with the level of resources necessary to do that. Are we going to have a police officer parked on every intersection in the city of Minneapolis, and are we willing to pay for that?
No, that's a good point. It would cost definitely more money, but I hear a lot of frustration from people because their garage has been broken into 3 or 4 times, right? And they don't feel like, whether it's safety ambassadors or any of these things are addressing those, and they can feel like they're not being heard. And so if it's not a police officer, what is it? And so that is further upstream, and I know that it's not, I don't want to oversimplify it. Like, I know just having police patrolling doesn't solve why people are creating crimes or any of those things.
No, I'll be the first to tell you that the police force at the size that it is right now is not meeting the safety needs of the city. So that's not the argument I'm making. The argument I'm making is that you need to look at the data and actually start informing your resource investment and policy direction based on that data. Our data says that we could have a police force of patrol officers. Now, again, there's going to be other roles for sworn officers, but patrol officers as low as 250, but that's only for the 911 call response.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to have other activities that they do, and we need to do that with intention.
So just thinking of those numbers, and the BCR number calls, it seems like they're very high.
Mm-hmm.
Are they sending out like a social worker to each one of those calls? I mean, it seems like they would need a huge staff of social workers.
Yeah, they send out the big thing that I did my very first few months in office under ARPA was invested in 2 more vans for BCR. So it's a van
Mm-hmm.
that's equipped with blankets, snacks, water, and 2 licensed mental health professionals, right? That is what we do. And there's a staffing model that you need to manage for 24/7 coverage. You need to have supervisors. You need to have a dispatching mechanism. And so we've matched the dispatching to the police precinct. And we have kind of like a first response for a precinct to precinct response, and then we have a backup response if that first one is out. And it's a pretty substantial operating budget to run that. It started as a pilot, and again, using data around what the effectiveness of it was led us to expand it. Because it didn't start 24/7, and it didn't start in all 5 precincts.
So I mean that's, I think, in my mind, some of the conflict, right? The data of it being effective. It's like, well, and it's hard, and I know that statistically crime is down in the city, so it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to say, like, is it these programs that are that, or are we just following national trends?
Well, if we're going to not be ideological about it, we're going to be really comprehensive in looking at root causes. And one of the things that baffles me is that people talk about Minneapolis as an outlier when we just went through a global pandemic that completely transformed society on a global level. Mm-hmm. And then we're curious as to why society is different, right? Now, we did experience a very specific incident in Minneapolis that had changed that, and that's the murder of George Floyd, right? We are unique amongst the world to have the murder of George Floyd. No other jurisdiction has ever had that type of global event happen. Every jurisdiction has had a black man killed by the police, not at the same time as a global pandemic and on video and in such an egregious way. That's what makes us unique. The murder of black men in America by police is not unique, actually, and that's the tragedy that we exist in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess, and we are definitely unique, and that was a tragic event, and we're still recovering from it, and some of these things will hopefully help. I guess my point is just that with all these different things going on, it's hard for the public to see, like, especially when they're still experiencing a high level of crime, to understand that any of this stuff is working.
Yeah, and again, going back to root causes, we had lockdown and there was no school. So are we surprised that there's a high, what's the word I'm looking for?
Poor reading and math?
No, correlation. Are we surprised that there's a high correlation in the spike of auto thefts by really young people in alignment with every school in the nation shutting down for 2 school years? Should we be surprised to see that correlation exists, right? There are other causal factors that are at play here that it's certainly correlated with our staffing levels of MPD, but then correlation is not causation. And I think that it wouldn't take a huge leap of faith to suggest that schools being shut down was a causal factor. Park and youth programming being shut down is a causal factor. This insane gap in wealth between the wealthiest Americans and the poorest Americans, causal factor, right? Mm-hmm. Now, we need to have random controlled trials to establish statistical significance and multivariate analysis to decide, is that correlative or causal? But I don't think it takes that much sophistication to see some of these things that have unfolded, not just in Minneapolis, but across the globe, and say, certainly the number of police officers that are on staff has an effect on crime, but also poverty, but also the lack of affordable housing, but also the lack of youth investment, but also schools struggling to be funded adequately, but also having teachers, but also having parents not having to work multiple jobs to make rent. So I think we need to have a much more expansive view of this than just the number of officers patrolling the streets.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. So I want to, move on a little bit from the topic of the safety for everyone and talk about space for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned, obviously it's part of the conversation, and I will say I had not really thought of correlating the schools closing with
youth
auto
crime?
theft. Well, auto theft in particular, but I guess youth crime. And that's something I would have to look into more. But housing obviously is a big issue in the city. And I'm not sure about the Northeast in particular.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you see as helping the Northeast in particular and the city overall to generate more affordable housing?
Yeah, so you have to start with what your goal is. And my goal is that anybody who wants to make a home in the city of Minneapolis, or anybody who wants to make a home in Northeast, to be more responsive to your question, should be able to do that, right? And any policy that can get us closer to that is something that we should be pursuing and implementing. So going back to this question about ideological approaches to governing, we need to not be ideological other than saying you should be able to afford a house, and that you should be able to say that in a very firm way. And by a house, I mean any type of adequate and dignified place. And what I see very commonly is people actually digging into ideological places when it comes to this. And I think the strongest ideological foothold that exists within the collective consciousness is this dogmatic belief in markets to solve every problem, right? And the thing that frustrates me the most about that really dogmatic adherence to market-based economics is that there's so much inconsistency and hypocrisy to it. Mm-hmm. So people will very quickly raise rent stabilization as being bad policy because of its impact on the supply and demand curve, right? Those same people don't have anything to say about zoning policies. So rent stabilization doesn't necessarily solve the affordability crisis. What it does do is it prevents displacement, especially on the margins, especially on the outlier of that bell curve. We see in some communities rent increases as high as 40%. And there's nothing that really protects a renter from that type of rent increase. So a landlord can just increase the rent for any reason that they want. And so if you're true about your dogmatic belief in the market to solve problems, you should be, if you're against rent stabilization as a result of that, you should also be calling for the abolition of zoning. We don't see people calling for the abolition of zoning because we know that we don't want to build daycares next to toxic and polluting factories. So everybody recognizes the societal benefit of land use, but doesn't acknowledge the market distorting features of land use planning. And so I think we need to be kind of consistent about that.
So the 2040 plan sort of did a lot for opening up zoning, right? Mm-hmm. So we can have higher density buildings and stuff like that. So
in concept, not necessarily in practice.
Well, so I guess I'm not clear on are you saying that zoning is still an issue that's preventing housing?
I would say that our building code is a really huge barrier. And I think that as we're looking at starting planning for the 2050 plan next year, we need to look at things like floor area ratios, setbacks, and other very, very technical considerations that has actually been one of the bigger impediments to us fully building out the 2040 plan. It turns out that for a lot of the sites that want to build a triplex on it that previously were single-family zoning, the practical reality of building out the economics don't work once you start trying to conform to both the building code and all the various land use policies. And so the 2040 plan was groundbreaking. It was innovative. We were a first in the nation to eliminate single family zoning, and that was a step in the right direction. I mean, the abundance agenda is all of the rage right now. And, you know, when that book first came out, I had a constituent reaching out to me saying, this is what we need to be doing. And I said, yeah, I agree with you. The challenge is that Minneapolis is the furthest along in the abundance agenda, and we have the reality of it playing out right now, which is I have one main triplex that I can think of in my ward that was facilitated by the 2040 plan.
Well, I'm without even knowing all those different zoning things, I mean, I never thought that people were going to triplexes were just going to start sprouting up, right? Because that would mean that all of a sudden your regular homeowners decided they want to become, a land owner, renter, and they have an extra place to stay, and it's just not the case for most people. I mean, but there was two parts to that equation. Zoning was one. You talked about rent stabilization. So are you in favor of rent stabilization?
I am.
And if so, what does that look like? It sounds like you're most worried about displacement along I forget how you said it, edges, if you will.
Yeah.
On the extreme parts.
Yeah. I will first acknowledge that rent stabilization is not the most efficient housing policy for solving the housing crisis. And I think that anybody who's a supporter of rent stabilization needs to acknowledge that. Mm-hmm. To me, its goal is to prevent displacement. The way that you're going to solve affordability is by massive subsidies of construction of new housing, right? That is the only way to do it. Right now, the most affordable way to build housing, which is, 5/1 really established plans, those cost on the order of $400,000 plus per unit to build. Mm-hmm. Nothing about that is affordable. So when we talk about affordable housing, especially under the current financial structure of that, what we're talking about is what financial tools you're using to build the housing more so than the cost per unit, and how we keep the cost per unit to the renter lower is through things like low-income housing tax credits and other financial instruments that are offsetting the private market. And so the only honest answer about solving the housing crisis is massive government stimulus and subsidy into the housing market, which is a political third rail because we're not ready to tax Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos at the scale that's necessary to actually meet the scale of need in our country. Minneapolis isn't the only jurisdiction that has a housing crisis because of a lack of supply. And a lot of this has to do with the 2008 financial crisis, and I'm old enough to remember that. I was fortunate enough to buy my first home in the golden year of 2007, right before the crash.
I did the same thing. Congratulations.
And that actually kept me in my Northeast starter home for a decade. Right. I bought that house as I went into grad school with the expectation of after I graduated, we would move out and start our family. That put our life on pause for 10 years. And then the moment that we weren't underwater on our mortgage, we sold at a loss. At least we didn't lose money on it, but we sold it for less than we paid for it. And then we wanted to start a family. We had finally gotten to a house where we felt like we were economically stable enough to do that. And that was when my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. So now we are without children, and I have a lot of time to focus on city government.
Okay. Well, that's a lot. I'm happy that you got the house. I'm very sad about your wife. My wife is still living, but has also had breast cancer. Mm-hmm. And so I know that is tough to go through.
It's really hard.
But you talked about housing subsidies, and
mm-hmm.
it made me think of, we have the Minneapolis Housing Authority,
mm-hmm.
right? Now, is that in the city budget? You put money aside for that, correct?
In the last couple years, and I really want to thank the leadership of Councilmember Wansley and BET Commissioner Sam Priest-Stinson, really powerful advocates for public housing, and we were able to reconstitute the public housing levy. So the city is levying an additional $5 million a year for the Public Housing Authority. And one of the big areas that I would say that's a more direct answer to your question around housing affordability that I'm advocating for is the concept of social housing. Now, I want to make a distinction between public housing and social housing. Public housing is essentially a program under the Housing and Urban Development Department at the federal level, so HUD. And what HUD has is called, I think it's the Faircloth Amendment, which essentially during the Reagan era, they just said, we don't want to do public housing anymore. We're going to put a cap on the number of units that any given housing authority can develop. And so MPHA is the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, and they manage the portfolio of those HUD Section 9 public housing units. That's the Holland High Rise in Ward 1, and I can't remember the other tower.
So the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority manages housing that's developed by HUD. Is that right?
Correct. The portfolio, and I mean, there's been very little new development from HUD over the years because of the Reagan era's like basically retreat from public housing as a real solution for housing affordability.
And some of the things I've heard is that the Minneapolis Housing Authority doesn't have enough money to keep up with all the maintenance.
They have over $150 million maintenance backlog that they will never be funded adequately to actually meet. So what they are essentially doing is managing the decline of their assets.
So how does when I see like those kind of gaps, I'm like, well, the city can't do this all by itself. So like, and that's where, I've had a lot of conversations recently about getting more of the local LGA,
local government aid.
Thank you. Back from the state. And I feel like at times, some of these problems are just too big for Minneapolis, but we're not. I don't know why we're not getting more money from the state, or we're not calling in the county more to do stuff. What's your take on that? I mean, should we be...
The housing crisis needs funding at the scale of a federal government. That is the only answer and the only solution, period. So now with that understanding, what do you do as a local elected leader? And this is, I think, where the major divide in our local politics are. Okay. So there is an entire category of people that says, the solution to the housing crisis is federal, and you are a city council member. You should do nothing. I do not live that way, right? This job is too hard. It takes too much work to get here for me to sit around doing nothing. So what do you do at the local level when you know that the scale of investment is vastly larger than a local government can raise through property taxes? This is true in housing. This is especially true in climate action, right? There are things that we can do. One, we can do a thing like pass rent stabilization, a less than optimal solution to housing affordability, but still delivering actual affordability outcomes for at least a category of our residents. And then what I believe is we need to do policy like that at the local level to catalyze action at the state and federal level. We've gotten leadership from the state in the local area housing tax. So LAHA, there's a new sales tax that's dedicated to housing, and that is a really good direction to go in. We get about $8.5 million from the state with that new tax. That's not enough money to meet the need, right? Yeah. So we need to use local government where we actually have the ability to elect leaders that are willing to take action, because what we see, if we're going to wait until the federal government's in a place to take action, we're just going to wait for forever. We actually have the political will within our residents. It's about our residents. It's not about us elected people. It's about our residents having the courage to say, we want to elect people who are willing to take action. And because of the geography and the culture of the city of Minneapolis, they have elected a majority of city council that is willing to take action. And that action needs to catalyze change at the state and federal level. And one of the things that I've learned is that if you ask people to do the right thing, they're not going to do it until they have no better choice. And so my crowning example of this is my partnership with Senator Omar Fateh and us securing minimum wage for Uber and Lyft drivers. I will be the first to tell you that a minimum wage in the city of Minneapolis is the not most optimal way of addressing pay inequity. However, we're not going to get action at the state without some sort of forcing function. And I think that's what the role of local government is. We force the issue and we get things to happen at more appropriate levels of government in response to the action that we take. And it is my firm belief that if we didn't pass minimum wage at the local level, it would have died at the state level. Just same way that the governor vetoed it the last time, because when you have the threat of multi-billion-dollar global corporations to pull out of the market, if you dare touch their profitability, it's really easy to blink in that scenario. And I will be also the first to tell you, if they actually followed through on that threat, I probably would not be able to win my reelection. That was a gamble that we took, and it was one of the scariest things that I've done in local office on a policy level, at least. But what we now have is the strongest driver protections in the entire country, not just the minimum wage, but additional protections for those drivers as a result of that taking action at the local level. So I see local level government as a catalyst for action at higher and higher levels of government. So that's a really big governing philosophy that I have.
Well, that's definitely a big topic there. I think, and to me, it's similar. I think of it in the same way that I kind of think of the citywide tax, income tax, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I hear what you're saying, that this could spur action at higher levels, but it does seem very risky for Minneapolis to, like, I wouldn't favor a citywide income tax. I mean, if you use the same tactics as used for the Uber thing, then you would still move forward with it, hoping that the state would somehow take action.
Not the same thing. So I want to be really clear about that.
But the thing with the citywide income tax, if we're going to go that route to raise revenue, it seems like it should be broader, right? So, like county, like multiple county.
Let me just correct a few things here. President Brandt on the Board of Estimate and Taxation has suggested income tax. But what we did on City Council in collaboration with the Board of Estimate and Taxation was do a comprehensive view of ways of generating municipal revenue, which includes an income tax, but is not explicitly about an income tax. So we're looking at a very expansive list of other ways that local jurisdictions raise revenue, including income taxes. So I think that's really important to clear up, because I think that the way that it got written up in the Star Tribune is City Council is looking for a wealth tax, right? Which I'm not looking at a wealth tax, but we're looking at a lot of different ways of generating revenue that's both sustainable to the goals that we have and equitable. But the difference between that and Uber and Lyft is Uber and Lyft are basically a duopoly, and I actually think the only reason that Lyft even exists as a company is so that Uber doesn't get taken down by antitrust. Now, they won't get taken down by antitrust under a Trump administration, because all they have to do is send enough money to the White House, and then they can go stand at inauguration with them, right? But prior to Trump 2.0 and the level of open corruption that exists within the wealthy class in America, I think that the only reason Lyft existed is so that Uber could claim that they're not a monopoly. So with that context, and seeing also the context of their threats to pull out of every market that ever dared to regulate them, including just licensing them, there was a much narrower track record of what the dynamics were of that market. And there was also a longer history of them making threats to pull out of markets for jurisdictions that were bringing forward regulations. And so that was a much more calculated and strategic risk. I think that we need to be more thoughtful when it comes to any new revenue generation that happens in the city of Minneapolis. And besides that, we won't have the taxing authority to do that without the support of the state government in the first place. We don't have the authority to just like willy-nilly create taxes. That's very much governed by the state legislature.
Yeah, I don't know if they'll ever get the support in the state. I don't follow the state that closely. Maybe that'll change next year after this election.
Our job at the local level is to have the relationships at the state so that we have a really clear eye of what is possible and achievable.
So I feel like we could go on for a really long time, but I do want to close things out here. So what are some of the key elements of your campaign or your vision for the next 4 years that we haven't had a chance to talk about that you want to make sure that people hear about?
One of my really big governing philosophies beyond just local government being a catalyst for bold action is local government being accountable to the actual voters and accessible to the voters. So since I got elected in 2021, I've held monthly office hours that are open to anyone. And it was actually really weird because one time, like, some senior leaders in the Church of Scientology showed up at one of my office hours from over in St. Paul just to introduce themselves. But I try to be open and accessible to anyone of any background.
Buying property in the Northeast.
Who knows? And then I also once a month have bookable time out in the community. So I really make it a point to be out in the community, accessible. I talk to anyone and everyone. It doesn't matter what your politics are, what your persuasion is, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. I think that it is the job of local government to be as accessible as humanly possible, and I try my best to do that. It's a very overwhelming position to be in, even at the ward level. It's 30 some odd thousand people that you represent, and it's very challenging to make sure that you have that connection with every one of those residents. But I make every effort that I can, given the tools that we have. And a lot of the time, and I think this is actually one of the things that frustrates me about the current political climate as well, we on city council get described as activists or out of touch when so much of what we do is at the request of our constituents.
Well, you did just use the word catalyst, right? Like,
yeah.
You want it sounds like you are describing sort of an activist agenda.
I mean,
with doing
Terry, I see you as an activist. It's not a pejorative.
Yeah.
People use it as a pejorative, but like, you're an activist. You exist in this world using your life energy to affect change. Mm-hmm. Is that a bad thing?
No, I guess it's just what's the expectation, like,
yeah.
What is your expectation of local government? I hear you definitely want it to be a catalyst for
for a fair and just society.
Yeah, big changes,
yeah.
Right? And I think there's definitely a lot of people who don't necessarily agree in taking big steps like that, or even trusting city government.
Yeah, okay, here, I have the perfect example of this question. Do I have to assume, or do I have to ask, are you a capitalist?
I believe in limited capitalism.
Okay, so I always use this example. Are we the type of capitalists that think that Target should declare bankruptcy because they just cannot compete with the sheer power and force of Amazon and their digital supremacy? Or are we the type of capitalists that believe that Target being headquartered in downtown Minneapolis is vital to our local economy, and therefore they should get support to stay in downtown?
Well, I guess that's a complicated question, because it's like, is the office downtown isn't the only part of Target, right? It's
Certainly.
a national corporation.
Certainly,
So
but
if
what
the
is our
whole-
what is our scope of concern?
Well, if the whole company is going down, you're probably wasting money if you subsidize the downtown Target just to have people going.
I'm not talking about the store. I'm talking about the corporate headquarters that is Target Corporation.
So I'll counter with another example that I was torn on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they wanted to put a massive Amazon facility in, I think it was Queens.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the things that helped AOC get elected, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
they led this big effort to keep them out.
Yeah.
Because they felt like it was costing the city too much in subsidies. People weren't going to get paid. You know, Amazon was seen as an extractive company. And, you know, I have very mixed feelings about that.
Yeah.
Because there's definitely some issues with their business model and how they pay people and everything else. But at the same time, you know, the city itself missed out on lots of jobs and
Mm-hmm.
lots of tax revenues. I don't know if I've figured out where I stand on something like that yet.
Right. These are hard choices with real trade-offs, and that's essentially what our job is in local or in all elected office is you are faced with a choice that has trade-offs. Mm-hmm. What is your judgment on the value of those trade-offs? That's essentially what our job is. Every yes vote and every no vote is essentially us saying yes to this series of trade-offs or no to those series of trade-offs, right? Mm-hmm. And so I use that example because I think most people I talk to in the city of Minneapolis think it's a good thing that Target Corporation is headquartered in downtown Minneapolis. Most people agree with that. What they don't agree on is the degree to which you should be subsidizing corporations to keep them downtown. That's that, right? And so what local government and actually what all levels of government are doing is they're picking and choosing winners based on a set of values and principles, mm-hmm. right? My values and principles are a series that see the inherent worth and dignity of all people, is that sees our trans community as mattering, that sees Black people as mattering, that sees our immigrant community mattering, and that the natural course of things, and by the natural course of things, I mean the current status quo of the people who preceded our generation and the choices that they made and who to prioritize, that status quo leaves a lot of people out of a fair and just society. And it's our job to look at the reality as it exists today and see the injustices in the world as they exist today and ask ourselves, are there a different set of trade-offs that would leave more people in a better place?
I don't know that I follow the connection between like subsidizing Target and...
Who do we have empathy for? The recent college grad looking for their first job in corporate America, or the unhoused neighbor who's struggling with substance use disorder? And where are we going to put our tax dollars to prioritize those people based on our sense of empathy?
So you're not trying to tie them to Target. You're just trying to make an example of saying like you're
governments are prioritizing
yeah.
constituencies at all decision points.
Yeah.
Which constituency are we prioritizing and why, and to what benefit and at what cost, right? And what I have seen in my life experience, and I'm not that young. I came in with a cohort of fairly young people. I'm not one of them. I'm in my mid-40s,
yeah.
And I'm Black. My dad picked cotton. He moved to Milwaukee to escape lynching. Mm-hmm. That's what what brought you to Milwaukee in the first place? He's from the Mississippi Delta in Dermont, Arkansas, rural Arkansas. Why did you move to Milwaukee? He said, I wasn't deferential to these white people and they were going to kill me for it. Mm-hmm. I'm in my mid-40s. I'm not that old, yeah. But, you know, I grew up in the most segregated city in the country. You know, you could cross a river and end up from the Black side of town to the Latino side of town, and then cross a freeway and then end up in the white side of town. That's the way Milwaukee is structured, and it wouldn't be the white side of town. It would actually be the Polish side of town versus the German side of town, right? Those structures are not accidental. redlining, racial covenants have created these conditions. Freeways slicing through South Minneapolis, Rondo. These are all decisions that governments made to benefit a certain part of our society at the expense of other parts of our society. We have had a long tradition of government seeing people as disposable. And today, those disposable people are getting labeled as trans, immigrants, black, brown, queer. Governments are constantly making decisions that benefit some and harm some other group. We need to be intentional about the decisions that we make and make sure that we are actually repairing some of those past harms. And I don't think that's woke. I think that is just a responsible member of society who's actually got some level of logic and empathy.
Okay. All right. Well, I feel like it'd be great to have you back. I feel like we just
I could do this all day.
Like half of the questions that I had for you. But I will say I have noticed how much constituency services you do, and that's really appreciated. And I really appreciate you coming on here today and talking. And I hope some of the people in the Northeast hear what you have to say.
I'm glad we were able to make it happen, and I apologize. I troubleshot it. I put a filter in my inbox for your emails because of your newsletter.
To have them go straight in the trash?
They went into a folder because they were interesting, but you have to understand, you subscribed to me without consent.
Yeah.
And so I thought the content was interesting, but it wasn't supposed to be in my main inbox, and so I missed it when your email came through.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.